Hey everybody, TacticAngel back on the PlayStation 5 to take a look at the Picardie in World of Warships Legends, a Tier 7 premium French battleship. For this review, I'll start with some history, move into analysis, discuss commanders with you, then run down the stats. Finally, we'll finish off with some gameplay, but if you do want to jump around, you should see some time codes in the description to help you out. In 1912, the French government read the room and rightly concluded that the Third Republic was really not all that well situated to fight a naval war, and that increasingly it seemed like it may have to do just that. HMS Dreadnought had largely hit the reset button on the naval arms race, and though France had already begun construction of its first dreadnoughts in the Corbeil class, the majority of the fleet consists of a curious collection of semi-dreadnoughts and more than a few pre-dreadnought battleships, about which the nicest thing you can probably say is that they are visually distinct. It is against this backdrop that the French government approved an ambitious shipbuilding program designed to increase the fleet to 28 battleships by 1920, counting only the remaining ships from the République class onward. The first class of ships laid down under this program were those of the Normandie class, which was intended to comprise of 5 hulls, all of which were laid down between April 1913 and January 1914. The follow-on to this were intended to be the Tourville class, if you read some contemporary English speculation, or the Lyon class, as they are more commonly known today. Say what you want about McDonald's, but the real short story of the Lyon class is that you take the Normandie and supersize it, adding an additional quad turret. Where those turrets show up is a question of speculation. What we have in game is a possible outcome, but a lot of publications and sketches from the time indicate a more traditional layout if you can overlook the novelty that we are still looking at quad turrets. The use of 34cm guns was largely one of necessity. As noted in game, larger gun calibers were considered, but the short story, why they weren't used, was that France didn't have that sort of gun available to it domestically. So when they sat down to design the Normandie and Lyon classes, they decided to do the practical thing and go with a gun that they had, rather than trust they would be able to produce a reliable 15 or 16-inch version in time to put it on these ships. But if they had, you'd have expected to see these with twin turrets rather than quads. If that had happened, then the Normandie and Lyon classes would have been very similar to other ships that were being built by the other great naval powers, like the British Empire and the United States. The idea here is to make up for individual shell weight by volume of fire, both with a large number of guns and hopefully faster reloads. This is all based on thinking from before the Battle of Jutland, where armor actually held up better than expected. If you don't count the British battlecruisers, who probably owe their fate to dangerous shell handling practices more so than a problem with their inherent survivability, the only capital ship that was lost to gunfire at Jutland was SMS Lutzow, and that was well after she had withdrawn from the battle. Anyway, I've already given away the end of the story though. France's 1912 building plan was both ambitious, since there weren't enough places that you could actually build a battleship in France, and also interrupted. In June 1914, a Serbian shoots the Austrian Archduke, all the dominoes fall, and the construction of the Normandie class slows to a crawl as manpower and funding shifts to the trenches. 10 years after their authorization, the Central Powers were defeated, the Washington Naval Treaty is signed, Europe's economy is in shambles, and terraforming the moonscape that is the eastern half of France seems like a better way of using money. Not only that, learnings from World War II would have pointed out that this design was obsolete at the time. 4 of the 5 hulls of the Normandie class were scrapped. The last, the Béarn, was converted to being France's first aircraft carrier, and, I hear, one of Prince Blip's favorite carriers to talk about. The Tourvilles or Lyons that would have come after remained nothing more than plans filed away at the Marine Nationale, and this ship in particular was never one of them. The Picardie is built along the same lines as the other ships of her presumed class. The 4 ships of that class were expected to be the Lyon and Lille, both named for places in France, then Duquesne and Tourville, named for French admirals. Picardie takes its name from the Picardie region, which for some reason is spelled with a Y in English, and was where some of the most fierce battles of World War I were fought, including the Battle of the Somme. There's really no explaining the year shown in game, except that this is probably the year of a fictional refit to this fictional ship. By 1939, France already was building the Richelieu class, and they wouldn't have had anywhere to actually build this. Also, they weren't going back to building the Lyon class, much less a down-gunned version with an even older 12-inch gun rather than 13.5. Wargaming sometimes does this to kind of explain away certain weaponry being present on the ship, rather than the year the ship actually would have been built. So we can be generous and say that's the reason why the year is there. The 25mm Hotchkiss mounts would have been brand new in 1939. The 13cm secondary turrets were designed in 1932. In any case, there's some history or something like it. So what about Picardie in the video game? Well, there are a handful of premium French battleships at Tier 7, and Picardie plays like none of them. In fact, it's pretty much what it looks like. A Lyon at Tier 7 and smaller guns, but with all the fittings that you'd expect from a Tier 7 ship, like a 32mm bow, but that's probably not specifically why you're going to be interested in the ship. And similar to Lyon, the thing you're going to notice first about this thing is
16 times the detail.
You've got a lot of guns. And if you can land a lot of shots, you're going to be able to do some good damage like that. In addition to the main battery, the Picardie also features an attractive secondary battery to folks who like that sort of thing, with excellent range and fire potential, even if it does come with middling damage, but functionally German pen. One other note, the stealthy description on the screen is actually true this time. Usually this isn't very helpful on a battleship, but in this case, Picardie is about a half a kilometer less visible than the next most stealthy battleship at the tier, so that's actually true. The downside to all of this is that the accuracy of the main battery doesn't just leave something to be desired, it gives you something to actively think about while the guns are reloading. Is my connection really that bad? Is this real life? It does kind of hide the fact that the penetration is pretty questionable because you don't get nearly as many opportunities to notice that the pen is pretty unimpressive compared to the number of times you'd expect. And once you get past that, the damage is kind of bad. All of this makes for a ship that has a low skill floor where it's never really going to be all that punishing to play, but it also seems to have a relatively low skill ceiling. That should make it relatively forgiving for folks who struggle in battleships, and somewhere between a carefree and frustrating opportunity if you're expecting this ship to do really well and carry you in a game. Those that want to lean into the secondary meme shouldn't be as bothered by the steep XP penalty applied to secondary damage, because the secondaries on this ship don't actually do that much damage to their targets, but they are very good at setting fires, which isn't penalized even if you start it with the secondary. And that makes a lot of sense if you don't really think about it. Now, to some degree, you'd expect commanders can fix all of this, right? Now, you might think that this is an endorsement to take a look into Juillard. You'll definitely have the most accurate version of this ship, and you can even make that AP do more damage. I might even add reducing the base speed of this to something more realistic as a positive too, but setting that historic bone to pick aside, he does make a bit of a difference here. His base trait is going to help you increase your chance of penning some of those more well-armored battleships out there at longer ranges, but it's not going to be enough to dunk on battleships at long range, much less the extra long ranges. Frankly, in a lot of ways, those super long ranges aren't that useful other than to keep this ship spotted by more people for longer, so consider that when making your choice. Instead, most people will probably choose someone like Guprat, and though he further separates this ship from its historic 21-knot brothers, that does have its uses, particularly in getting into range with those long-range secondaries. In fact, you can run him with the secondary range and battleship concealment inspiration and get pretty close to closing the gap between your secondary battery firing range and the sea detectability of the ship. Then you just need to worry about a stealthy cruiser or destroyer giving you away before you can pounce on something. That, and of course, the server will decide you simply don't hit anything with your main battery guns the entire game, and that's the major trade-off. The base commander, Louis Dufresne, actually ends up something like the uncomfortable middle ground. Yeah, you can shoot a lot of HE in this thing, and 2% is a larger relative improvement on Picardie than it is on other battleships, but that is still more likely to help your secondaries, and even taking a look at me now and 2 secondary inspirations, you're not going to get quite as close to closing that gap between sea detectability and your secondary firing range as you will with Guprat. The base trait will help if you hit anything, if you want to commit to HE. It's all completely possible, but I've never run out of a secondary targeting consumable, much less when my range wasn't 11 kilometers, so the only reason I could recommend this is if that you were hell-bent on making overly long videos about ships that include a commander section and you wanted to give each of those commanders an honest shot. And I can't think of any reason someone would want to do that. So that brings us neatly along to stats. We're of course going to talk about Picardie in the big picture. Comparing it to the Lyon is not really fair, but it might be a little bit illustrative in the first section, which is survivability. With just 61,000 hit points, Picardie sits about 5,000 points less than your average Tier 7 battleship. Though based off a Tier 7 ship, she gets a bit of extra armor everywhere. From a very marginal 2 or 3 millimeter improvement to the torpedo bulge and the superstructure to the very important improvement of the 32 millimeter bow and deck. You still have a functionally impenetrable icebreaker, so she will repel more firepower on the outside than Lyon, though your belt remains a relatively unimpressive 300 millimeters. But those changes are all basically what you'd expect on a Tier 7 battleship. Inside, the story of Picardie is basically the same as Lyon. It has a below the waterline citadel. The sides of that citadel are a pathetic 22 millimeters, but it's guarded by this beefy 70 millimeter turtleback. The chances that this thing gets citadeled inside of 15 kilometers is statistically still significantly better than your chances of winning the lottery, but it's by a much smaller margin than in other ships. At range against plunging fire, expect slightly different results because the 40 millimeters on top of your citadel is not going to repel larger shots, and it's certainly not going to do much to stop ships like August von Parseval or Enterprise from ruining your day. You do come with a 32 millimeter torpedo reduction. This is above average. It's far from incredible, but it's basically double the damage reduction that you get from Lyon. As mentioned before, you have
16 times the detail.
That is a 4x4 arrangement of 12-inch guns. They enjoy a surprisingly average 12.3 kilometer range, only a slightly better than average 27-second reload, and an average turret rotation. That stat is slightly misleading though, since for some reason, the middle 2 turrets have 360 degrees of rotation. HE shell damage is 3,500, and a very, very low 15% fire chance. The AP damage is 7,450, which makes for the most dainty citadels among battleships. In theory, though, you're going to be firing 16 shots. This tends to make your DPM look pretty good for both HE and AP on a spreadsheet because of all that multiplication. This is, when you're not looking at a spreadsheet, they do tend to balance out by treating your aiming reticle as maybe a suggestion rather than any great indicator of where your shells might land. Then when you do hit, the penetration of Picardie shells is predictably lackluster. Within 5 kilometers, it can citadel most battleships provided they don't have a turtleback. But at 10 kilometers, only particularly poorly armored battleships are really susceptible to anything but standard pens. Though it did seem to be about the best range to make short work of cruisers. If you're too close to them, you will still overpen them all the time. Another key feature of Picardie on the screen is its secondaries. The key feature here is that they have exceptional range. Everything is 130 millimeters, so you end up with a total of 12 guns on each side. The 1800 isn't incredible damage, but Wargaming says that these have 32 millimeters of penetration, rather than the standard 1/6 that you might expect. The low number of guns puts you dead in the middle of the pack for DPM, but the 9% fire chance on average on every one of them makes you one of the better fire starters, mostly behind other French ships that have incredible volume of fire but actually can't damage targets, and Scharnhorst. You're behind Scharnhorst by a lot, and that probably shouldn't be surprising. The AA on Picardie is pretty bad. The only real saving grace here is the 5.2 kilometer long range on some of these 130s, the 83 damage on long range, 80 on medium, and another 51 at point blank, combined to a total of 214, which is about half the DPS of your standard battleship at the tier. This means if you are going to avoid the carrier's attention, you'll have to find some other way than simply defeating planes. And fortunately, that comes in the form of quite good maneuverability. The 30 knots you start out with would have been very surprising to the people who designed the Lyon class, but this is just average for the tier. Where Picardie does feel good is both her turning circle and rudder shift. They're both tied for best in class. And since it's not tied in both of those stats with any of the same ships, you might say Picardie has the best maneuverability of any tier 7 ship, as long as you're not measuring straight line speed. The concealment of the ship is, as I've said already, very good. By sea, you're actually not half a kilometer, you're 400 meters better than the next ship, and 900 better than the average. You have a similar advantage by air, and when firing in smoke, 11.1 is second only to Scharnhorst for shortest firing penalty. Finally, we get to talk about consumables. Picardie has a normal battleship damage control. You have 3 charges of an improved heal, restoring 2/3 of 1% for 28 seconds, 80 seconds on the reload. It's not incredible, but that does help a little bit with your HP deficit. Next, you have a main battery reload booster. This is always a neat trick, and certainly while having 16 guns, being able to reload twice as fast is
16 times.
Just don't spoilers, Christian.
16 times
60
the
times.
detail.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
as useful, I guess. Thing is, you have crap dispersion. This really just means you miss a whole lot more shots. But on the subject of dispersion, there you have it, secondary targeting enhancement. This is a bit different in that it both decreases your reload time and also tightens up those shots. You also get 3 of them by default. However you want to look at it, it's an interesting set of consumables, because if you want to make the use of your secondary ability, the reload kind of suffers. And if you want to use the reload, you'll probably never get into range to use those secondary consumables. It kind of balances itself out, and more on that later. And as we come to the gameplay, we're going to be on Scandinavia. Obviously, here we have the Picardie. It has the standard camo on it, as if you could tell. I'll go ahead, put my commander up on the screen pretty much immediately. And what we're doing here is nothing really special. What we've got is a whole bunch of investment into secondaries. That more or less means that I'm leaning into the XP penalty and just figuring I'll come out on the better of it on the end. It is what it is, but basically what you're going to see here is the accuracy on this ship at its worst possible state. Because obviously we're not doing much of anything here. Actually, we might not be doing anything at all to control where the shots are flying. So WTF shells incoming, etc., etc. WTF means where's that flying? For anybody who hasn't been watching since my Monarch review. Anyway, we're rolling out towards the far west side of the map. I'm starting to notice that kind of nobody else has bought into the prospect of winning this side. You can see our 2 cruiser friends kind of sailing off. I do have HE loaded here off the bat. In theory, with 12-inch shells, maybe it doesn't make a lot of sense to shoot a whole bunch of AP at the bow of battleships or even cruisers at the beginning of the game. So that explains why I've got these loaded. That said, you can kind of see I put 16 shells out there. I hit 3. Not exactly a wild success. And the 3 shells at 15% fire chance. Not really a great opportunity to actually set any fires. I'm kind of judging where that guy's going to end up because he has engaged the border. That means that he is going to scoot along the white line until he manages to turn around. So I aim well above him. And either because that was a good decision or because I just had enough shells that were flying vaguely in his direction, we did land 1 citadel. Now, 1 citadel added to the other 12 hits that we've already got has gotten us all the way to almost 24,000 damage at this point. That does include several fires. So, long story short, not an incredible amount of damage. You can see that we are currently disengaging. Having driven out there and having had no support, and not really wanting to try to muscle our way through that because that was not going to work, we turn all the way around. You can see the actual sort of... I don't want to say it has good concealment. It has good concealment for a battleship. And I do actually wish that there were more ships that had larger differences in concealment than what's currently in the game. But Picardie currently is the winner on that. And that's fine. That time we managed to land 8 shells, which is actually pretty impressive for this ship. It's not a ton of damage, but we do manage to land 8 shells. Turning in, we mostly overturn his aim. That's a pretty good thing for Picardie. The tight turning circle is going to help you a little bit here. Here we have a 15-kilometer shot on Amagi. I would guess 4 hits. 5 hits. Wow. I mean, it's fine. It's fine. So, we have managed to recover a lot of the hit points that we've lost. In part, that's because of our build. We do have secondaries kind of going big time on this, and we also have a couple of things that are going to limit the number of fires we can take and increase the amount of damage that we can recover. That doesn't actually keep our secondaries in the game, but it does help us stay in the game. And I'm kind of looking what's going on. This Neptune is turning out, and I unleash all of these shells all at once, predicting that he might end up more or less in the optimum kill zone for the ship. You can see we're maintaining a pretty good angle on Amagi. If he were to shoot AP, which he isn't, those would mostly be bounce chances, if not auto bounce. And we do pretty well. We do pretty well there. He is within our secondary range, so we're just letting those go to town. Unfortunately, if he turns out like this, there's not a lot that I can do with my main battery, so we start loading HE again. It might not be very high damage HE, but you know what? It doesn't bounce. So we land a few thousand damage there. We're up to 100,000. And basically, this is one of those opportunities that you get with one of these secondary battleships where you're just like, I am going to enforce my will upon you. And I guess the same thing goes for the island, because we immediately run into it. And that's fine. It keeps us inside the cap. We will go ahead and get the XP. And you can see as we back up here that we have already gotten more or less 3 of our turrets in the right direction. Now, we're not firing right now, so it doesn't make all that much of a difference. But this is illustrative of if you were running at somebody in Picardie, you might be able to actually get your turrets around pretty quickly and keep 3/4 of your guns more or less on target. You've got some superstructure. It's a little bit more restrictive if you're trying to shoot forward. It's a little bit less restrictive if you're trying to shoot backwards. Something. Insert joke about the French running away, etc. Now, what we see is Plymouth is slowing down. We're trying to gauge where it is going to be when it finally comes to a stop, because if we can land some shots, we do stand a pretty good chance of citadeling it. Get a couple of those, not enough to actually kill the ship, but certainly enough to rack up about 19K. And we're on to République. You can see in the meantime, we've rotated all of our turrets back to this side of the ship. It's not bad. It's not particularly good. But since half of your turrets don't have to rotate all the way around the other way, it's a notable advantage. So that'll bring us along to the closing thoughts on Picardie. I think the first 2 words that came to mind for this ship was, for me, aggressively mediocre. I was arguing a bit with JC about it, and his preferred 2 words would have been purposefully obsolete. They're both kind of true. Effectively, the ship insulates you pretty well from the consequences of your own mistakes, while simultaneously balancing out whatever you're doing with several servings of RNG. Go broadside to something, sure, you're going to take damage, but it's not like anybody's going to citadel you. Get into position and need to suddenly transfer your guns across the deck. Lucky you, those 360 turrets are going to get 3/4 of your firepower on target in no time. For better or worse, maybe it doesn't really matter how well or how poorly you aim, just because the shells are going to go where they want to go anyway. Cover that with a layer of secondaries, pray for some fires, and that's Picardie. You can try as hard as you want, it probably won't behave. You can play as poorly as you want, it's probably not a disaster. It's not an unenjoyable experience, but it'd be far from my first pick if the game was on the line. And that's just my impressions of it. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And of course, I'll see you on the next one.